I am excited to welcome Dr. Donnetrice Allison as the speaker of the virtual program, Racial Education, Self-Care, and Unmasking Microaggressions. The Ocean County Library is committed to providing library services, materials, and programs for all of the Ocean County residents. This program, like all of the programs at the Ocean County Library, goes to the heart of our mission, connecting people, building community, transforming lives. We welcome the use of chat feature as questions and comments will be reviewed and then passed along to the presenter during the question and answer portion of the program at the end of the event. Please keep the chat to the topic only. Anyone who uses the chat feature to violate rules of conduct will be removed from the program. Without further ado, please allow me to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Donnetrice Allison is the Chair of Africana Studies and Professor of Communication Studies at Stockton University. At this time, I will now turn the program over to Dr. Allison, who will start the program with a more in-depth introduction of her qualifications.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for participating and signing up for this discussion. Just wanted to kind of quickly give you a little bit of background. I have been teaching for a little over 25 years, and I have been at Stockton going on about 18 years. And I arrived at Stockton initially in the communication department, where I spent a lot of time teaching about interpersonal communication and also intercultural communication, how cultures can interact, how cultures should interact, and how to communicate when there are cultural differences. And I also started working with the Africana Studies program pretty much as soon as I arrived at Stockton, teaching classes on introduction to Africana Studies and also teaching classes about film and television and how African Americans historically have been portrayed in film and television. I have also been involved with pretty much immediately, again, arriving at Stockton, devolved in diversity education and diversity and equity work. I was a part of the diversity committee that we have there, where we do educational events and all of that. And I have been doing workshops and seminars and teaching on these issues for well over a decade. So that is just a little bit about my background. Now, just to give you a little background on terminology. So part of the purpose for today is really just understanding terms and understanding what things mean. So I wanted to give you a sense of that, terminology and what things mean. So when we talk about the term race, we are talking about a socially constructed category for grouping people based on features like skin color and hair texture and eye shape. When we talk about racism, we're getting a little more extensive. We're talking about discrimination and prejudice that is based on race and is typically directed against people who have less social power by those who have more social power. So racism can be expressed by individuals through certain beliefs and attitudes and actions, comments, all of those kinds of things. And racism could also be institutional, carried out through certain laws, certain policies and practices that have historically been put in place in this country, laws and policies and practices that restricted the movements or activities or advancements of people of color. When we talk about the term anti-racism, that term specifically refers to being actively involved in working against unjust systems. And it's not simply to say, well, I'm not racist, or I don't do these particular things. I don't do anything to stop anyone who's a person of color. That's fine. That's great if you don't do anything like that. But anti-racism, or being considered an anti-racist, are people who are actually trying to stop the systems that are in place that essentially intentionally try to restrict others' behaviors and advancement, right? So that's a little bit different than just saying, well, I don't do the things to hold anybody back. But then the question is, do you do the things that will help to advance equality? Okay, so that's a little bit of a different question. Now, this idea of race being a social construct is important. A social construct is an idea that has been created and accepted by people in a society. And one of those social constructs, as it relates to what we're talking about today, is the idea that white is superior to Black, right? So this social construct is what contributes to race. Race in and of itself has no biological standing, right? So there have been all kinds of scientists who have tested and looked at DNA of an African American and a white person, or people from different parts of the world. And there's really no significant differences, okay, aside from those features. However, many, many years ago in our society, there were scholars who started to establish this idea of white being superior to Black, right? So I have a couple of names up here. There are others, but these are some of the earliest examples. So a scholar by the name of Richard Boyle wrote a book called Of the Nature of Whiteness and Blackness in 1664. And some of the things he talked about was the ugliness of Black skin. It's not attractive, all of those kinds of things. And that whiteness was superior in terms of European features and all of that. So that, again, that kind of book is a part of our historical documentation of looking at what early scholars had to say about these differences. Sir Isaac Newton wrote a book called Optics in 1704. We know Sir Isaac Newton as a mathematician and this, great scholar who has been revered. But one of the things that he talked about early on was this idea that white was the center of all colors, right? So he talked about it from this optic and color perspective, but it was still a part of this narrative that was establishing white as superior to Black. And so as we move through the time period of enslavement and all of that, we continued to push this notion of whiteness being superior to Black, not just physically in terms of the different looks of people, but also in terms of intellectually. You had those who argued that intellectually, Black people were simply not as smart as white people. One of the people who wrote extensively about that was Thomas Jefferson. So again, it's in the historical record. These are people that you can look up and look at what they had to say. So that social construct, that idea was established hundreds of years ago, this idea of white being superior to Black, okay? And that it has become ingrained essentially in our country, and in other countries, not just in our country. So what is a microaggression? Microaggression, subtle verbal and nonverbal slights, insults, indignities, denigrating messages directed toward an individual due to their group membership. And it's often done unconsciously. People make insensitive comments all the time, but oftentimes people make insensitive comments and assumptions about a person based on race, right? And so that is something that is a common experience for folks who are the minority in a particular school or in the workplace or something like that. So a recent example, actually, I can give you. A student reached out to me, and this student has dreadlocks. And so this student said that, she had a professor who was saying that, asking her if her dreadlocks were made out of animal hair or sheep wool. The professor asked her if she needed to wear sunscreen since she was so dark. Why would she need to wear sunscreen? So those kind of comments hurt. They are negative assumptions made about people. And one of the descriptions given about microaggressions is they're like a bunch of little paper cuts, right? You know that if you get a little paper cut, you immediately notice that it hurts. But if you get, several, like you keep getting paper cuts throughout the day or throughout your experience working in a particular environment, going to school in a particular environment, then that is really going to have an effect on you, a negative effect on you. So when we look at the impact of microaggressions on different organizations, some of the research looks at that it stalls recruitment efforts. Like certain other people wouldn't necessarily want to work there if they know that the people of color who work there are having a negative experience. It lowers morale and engagement there, lowers productivity. And often there's a high turnover rate in an organization like this, that people are having to deal with regular microaggressions. The impact of microaggressions on receivers of these aggressions. So again, there's a lot of research out there that talks about experiences of depression, anxiety, when you're going through these kind of situations, again, on a regular basis. It can affect the mental health of faculty and staff and students of color at predominantly white schools, where you experience microaggression, stereotyping. I've had lots of students come to Stockton and tell me that in high school, their counselors or teachers told them, well, you might want to major in this because this is going to be too hard for you. There were assumptions made about them because they were a Black student or a Latino student who the assumption is you can't handle the hard subjects, so maybe you want to consider majoring in certain things. So there's also can be campus isolation, or the campus climate can be troubling, which could lead to a sense of isolation. You kind of feel like you don't belong. So those are some different things that can have an impact if you're receiving these microaggressions. Another term I wanted to touch on just quickly today is critical race theory. So we've been hearing this a lot on the news. One of the news programs that I was watching talked about how this term, you hardly ever heard it before 2020. And they actually did a test where they started counting the number of times you heard this term. And on Fox News was one example that they gave. You heard it in 2020 like 132 times. You heard the words critical race theory. That shot up in 2021 to 1,860 plus times, right? So just hearing this term and this term being used as a catch-all just for anything dealing with race. The reality is critical race theory has been around since the 80s. It is a theoretical framework that was used by law school scholars. There were law school students who came up with this terminology. And what they were examining was the intersectionality, which essentially means overlapping social identities and how that deals with racism. So if you are of more than one minority category, right? So you are a woman and you're Black, and how does that impact you in certain organizational environments, right? So this was later extended to also examine just systems, right? So when you hear the term systemic, that is talking about how the impact, how something impacts the whole and not just parts of a particular system. Systematic is talking about something that is purposeful and intentional. And it's also done in a methodical way, right? So this theory was being used to look at both of those things, how race and racism can be systemic, like part of the whole system, and also systematic, where some things are purposeful and intentional, right? So it was looking at it at the criminal justice system level, at the level of our governments, laws that were passed, et cetera, right? So it's been around for decades. And it's just recently that you started hearing this so much, right? So one of the scholars who was a part of beginning this idea, Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, she was a law student at the time. She's a professor of law now. She simply defined it as a way of seeing, attending to, accounting for the ways that race is produced, the ways that racial inequality is facilitated, and ways that our history has created these inequalities, right? This is not something that is being taught in K through 12 school. This is a higher level theoretical framework that's used in law schools and graduate schools. I work with a lot of high schools, local high schools, for the dual credit program that Stockton has for African American studies. What the school systems are trying to do is simply teach more African American history. That's what they're trying to do. They're not teaching critical race theory. They're just trying to make sure that they're teaching African American history as a part of American history. That's what the schools that I'm working with are doing. That's what most of the schools are doing. So I just kind of wanted to make that clear. And the last thing I wanted to touch on before we just kind of, get to some questions, this notion of self-care and healing and activism, right? So those who, like myself, have been doing this work for many years have to attend to their own physical and mental health. This kind of work where you're teaching about and talking about race and racism, whereby you're constantly coming up against a lot of resistance to talking about it, is exhausting. It's mentally exhausting. And so you have to find ways to protect yourself and protect your own sanity and your own mental health. So I was a part of a team that created a whole series of online workshops during the height of 2020 when all the protesting was happening. And at the beginning of the session, one of the things we did was just check in with people and see, how are you feeling? Like, what are you going through? Because again, that's important for people who have, and it was specifically for a lot of K through 12 teachers, because they were having a difficult time in their individual schools trying to talk about this stuff, but coming up against a lot of resistance to talking about essentially what was going on in the world. And so again, I say that is difficult. That can be really, really exhausting. So you have to find time and ways to care for yourself. It always, for me, goes back to that idea, like they say on airplanes, that when the oxygen masks come down, you have to make sure that you have yours on before you're helping somebody next to you. You have to care for yourself before you can really contribute anything in the world, before you can be involved in community service and all of that kind of work. You have to care for yourself. So that's really what that's talking about. And the idea of healing, sadly, I feel like when it comes to issues of race and racism, we're not going to heal until we face it, right? So one quote that I kind of heard in passing: we cannot fix what we cannot face. And that is so often the case, that if you deny there's a problem, then you're not going to do any effort to try to deal with it. That's the same thing in a marriage situation. If you say, oh, everything's fine, then whatever is going on at the surface is not going to get addressed. That's just a reality. That's a reality in this country when it comes to race and racism, and in many other countries. So when it comes to activism and anti-racism and this idea of actively being involved in the change, you have to simply ask yourself, what can you do or what are you doing to help bring about change, to help, this is an issue that we have been dealing with as a country for hundreds of years. And if we are ever going to get to a place where we can get beyond it, it has to be with facing it, as I mentioned before, but also with people who are committed to actively bringing about change and equality and equity in all of our systems. And so that's really, kind of the crux of it, is actively helping to bring about change, actively helping to be as great as we can be, right? As a country, because yes, we have great things in place. And if we can get beyond issues of race and racism, constantly fighting about that and going back and forth about that, then we can be even greater. So I'm gonna stop the share there and see if we have any questions that anyone wants to address, or Donna, if you want to give me any questions.
Does anyone have any questions that they'd like entered into the chat? You are now welcome to enter them in the chat.
If not, I appreciate everybody's time and attentiveness to the session. I see one question about some practical ways we can incorporate anti-racism into our daily lives. And I would suggest just kind of getting involved there are different community activities, community service activities. Every year there's usually an MLK Day of Service that started with that idea of helping others, helping the less fortunate. And in our country, unfortunately, a lot of the less fortunate often tend to be people of color. So the extent to which you can get involved and sign up for things like that would be a great help. We're volunteering for schools that are in your district, even if oftentimes schools are looking for volunteers, even if you don't have children in those schools. I know that when my children were in the elementary school level, I just volunteered my time to put on a Black History Month program, or just really to put on something that they hadn't normally done, because what typically tends to happen in a lot of the school systems, and my students have talked to me about this as well, is they'll say, it seems like we only talk about the same people over and over again. So we only talk about Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks, and there's so many other people that we don't know or never heard of. And so I just kind of volunteered to, let's talk about some other people that we've never heard of, some African Americans in history who have done, something significant, made some significant contribution, whether it's to the military or to the education or whatever. And let's bring those names forward, and let's have the kids learn about them. So the kids did, like, they would each get a person, and then they created, it was almost like a science fair where folks would come in and they could hear about some different people that they never heard of. The kids were learning about people that they had never heard of. So, it was just one way to volunteer my time and my education in a school. So those are some of the kinds of things that I think are practical that we can just get involved in locally to help out. So thank you for your question.
Okay, do you see any other questions? I don't see any other questions.
I do not.
Thank you, Dr. Donnetrice Allison. It was an excellent definitions and very good. Thank you for participating with us this evening. Have a good evening.
You too. Everyone else, thank you for coming.
Support public libraries. Like, share, and subscribe for more great videos.